All right. Hey, everybody. So this is Josh Bruce, and we're continuing to kind of go through this class now, or the string class. From the last video, I wanted to sort of mention something. Because we went to using these traits and having sort of multiple test files. All right, so we created this manipulation test file, which basically is just string manipulation and different ways of doing that and different ways of testing for it. And initially we did inheritance, where we inherited from main test, and that was to get to these functions or these methods that are inside of what this test strings class is now. And we also talked about protected, because that was how we could do it through inheritance, right? To give access to the manipulation, or give the manipulation test access to these functions. We did it by using protected. But when we made it a trait, I was able to convert them back to being private, which gets away from the conflating of access control versus the actual inheritance mechanism of PHP. And the reason being is because, again, those traits are something that the class has, right? It becomes part of the class within that closure, right? So within that curly brace. So anyhow, wanted to touch on that. Also, I know that these videos are coming out pretty far apart from one another, and I wanted to make sure that I had touched on that each one of these videos is roughly 30 minutes, and so basically if this is the 10th video, this will be 5 hours of actual work time, right? Because I'm not editing out any kind of the foibles and things like that, right? Like I'm not, this isn't scripted. You kind of get to see different things and see me messing around and trying to figure out certain things that I don't know inherently, right? So anyhow, back to manipulation. So manipulation tests, we've got that one figured out. Let's go ahead and make the next one. I'm actually planning to leave the initializers inside of main test. And the reason that I want to do that is because one of the things about tests that, or one reason that I think tests exist, is to act as sort of documentation. So basically, people, I've heard a lot of discussion as to, why do we do unit testing and why do we do testing in general, and that sort of a thing. And part of it, for me at least, is that basically the most comprehensive documentation with regard to how a system works, okay? Like what happens when I do this or a user does that or whatever, the most comprehensive documentation is the actual code, right? And so basically, one step away from that, right, where it's still documentation, but it's a little bit farther removed, or it's still executable code, but it's still it's a little bit removed from being as pure as the string class itself and how this works, is the test suites or the test bed in general. So when somebody besides me shows up and says, how does this work, they should be able to look at the tests and say, okay, how can I initialize an empty string? Well, this is how you do it, right? How do I initialize a string with a string? Well, this is how you do it, and so on and so forth, right? Like it's something that tells them what to do, or how to do it. And so what the by leaving the initializers inside of the main test, somebody can show up and say, main test, oh well, if that's the main test, let me take a look at that and see what that's all about. And they can then discern, oh, okay, so this is the initialization. Because without initialization, all the other ones don't really matter. And so now, one of the other things that we did in the last session was to sort of put these into groups, and of, all of these test functions that return actual strings, and that sort of a thing. And so now we're just sort of separating out the tests that way. So, oh, well, that's metadata. So, because I say it's comparison and metadata, and so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and just put that inside the metadata test file. So metadata, right, and then we have an array, so new file, array, and I think if these were a little bit more complex, or if there were more of them, I would be running my unit tests in between each one of these moves. But anything that happens should be relatively easy to recover from. So if we come here, array, go ahead and close that, and then put this inside there. All right, so now everybody should be, all of these tests should be using the test strings, all of the, and PHP unit, because all of these end in that uppercase test.php, PHP unit should run them all. And looks like I messed up something. Oh, names. Let's make sure our class names are correct. So this is metadata test. This is string test. This is array test. Yep. Huh. Not sure how I feel about 5 of the tests disappearing in that move. No, no, never mind. We're good. No? Huh. I don't think we lost any tests. String test, array test. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Oh, yeah. So, rename array test. There we go. Okay, so, right, now we're back to here, which is good. And let's take a look at, I mean, since we're refactoring, I would like to take a look at some of these and maybe talk about some things. So, for example, let's look at append real quick. So with append, append is basically, it lets us do some repeating, right, with this count. And so, but we have this for loop. And some people get really hung up on for loops. There are some folks who are like, replace that for loop with this method or from the standard library, or do this other thing, or for loops are evil, right? And I think I think for loops and like the only other argument or discussion that I see a lot through with developers outside of for loops is convert that if statement to a switch, right? And so in theory, what we should be able to do is actually replace this with something from the standard library. And it's basically string repeat, and it's going to be the value, and the multiplier is count. So if I do that, right, my tests pass, right? So that refactoring, right, changing the internal structure of that function, doesn't do anything to mess up the tests. But there's a trade-off here, right? And this goes back to something I think we just briefly touched on in one of the earlier videos, is this notion of who's coming in behind you, right? And also, when you're learning a language, or when you know a language, what exactly are you saying that you know? Okay, because languages deal with at their base, they're all syntax and semantics, right? So syntax is like the curly braces for closures, this being an array, which also equals the open close square brackets being an array, and that being an alias for a function that is part of the standard library. That's all syntax, right? The fact that everything has to end in a semicolon, and like hopefully you get the idea, the way operators work, what operators exist, right? Everything that deals with more punctuation than anything. So that's all syntax. And then there's semantics. And semantics, just like any other language, right? Like written language works this way as well, which is, what order do you put things in, and what things exist for what purpose, right? So if we say static public function, what that tells the computer is it's a function. So there's some operations that are going to happen when this thing gets called. It's going to take parentheses, it can take arguments, it can do all these things, right? Public says this is the access control level of this thing, and limits who can call it. Static, well, this is on the class, and then not an instance, which basically changes things from, so a static method, that's why we have to do class, because we're just calling it on the class itself. We're not calling it on an instance. But when we call it on an instance, we basically say, whatever the variable name is, and we put an arrow, right? So str : is letting the computer know, hey, we're doing this against the class itself. Don't worry about the fact that there's not an instance. Versus this variable that basically represents the object or an instance of an object, or at least a pointer to it, and then calling a method or a property, right? So it tells the computer, hey, the server in this case, hey, this is how we want to call this thing, right? So that's semantics and syntax, right? Semantics is also that for loop itself, right? For I equals 0, semicolon, blah, 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 right? That is the semantically correct way of writing a for loop inside of PHP. Now, it just so happens that other languages have adopted that, and I'm not saying PHP was first. What I'm saying is that it's kind of a standard thing, right, across multiple languages. So that's syntax and semantics. So when somebody says, hey, do you know PHP, is that what they're talking about, right? Is this what they're saying, that you understand the syntax and semantics of it, right? Or are they asking, do you know how to make an array, right? Which can be done with square brackets or array as a function call. Or do you understand how to do a callback function inside of a function? Do you know how to do X, Y, and Z, right? Like, do you know why there's a while loop and a for loop and a for each, and how that works, and so on and so forth, right? Like, do you understand the mechanics of executing code in that language? Or do they mean, do you know the standard library, right? Because every language has one that I've used anyway, right? So there's the syntax and the semantics of the language, and if you're using a C-based language or even a Java-based language or anything like that, something that's close, that's usually pretty easy to learn, the syntax and the semantics. The mechanics are usually pretty much all the same, right? Every language I'm aware of, you have the ability to create an array, and sometimes those are called lists, sometimes they're called something else. Those collections, so to speak, may also be dictionaries where instead of, say angle bracket 1 comma 2 comma 3, you would have basically a key, right? And so in JavaScript it's JSON, and with PHP we use the rocket ship, right? So I can say first, and that's the key for 1, but it's first as a string, rocket ship, or I can't remember if that's actually what people call this, but like the equals greater than, and then 1, because I'm basically saying this key equals this value. And so when somebody asks for that key, return that value, right? And so is that what somebody's asking that you know with regard to the language? Because that stuff, depending on the language, that can be pretty easy to learn as well, right? Depending on the semantics and the syntax, the differences, right? Now, if you go from, say, something like PHP to something like Objective-C, it might be a little bit harder, right? Because function calls are really different in comparison. Or even Python or Haskell, right? And Haskell is probably even a farther jump because Haskell is a functional language, not more of an object-oriented language. Or again, are they asking you about your knowledge of the standard library? So all that to say, when we replace this, when we say this string append, dot equals string repeat value count, we are now using something from the standard library. And if somebody comes in and they don't know what str_repeat means, it's going to be difficult. It could be difficult for them to, wrap their head around what's going on there. Whereas somebody coming in with just knowledge of how a for loop works, right, which is pretty standard issue in a lot of languages, maybe not syntactically, or the semantics might be different, but the concept is the same. They can look at it and go, we've got this for loop, and we're appending this string multiple times. So if we ever end up porting this over to other languages, it could start to get, it could be difficult to port over, more difficult to port over to a different language, because that standard library may not have an equivalent, right? Like I wouldn't be able to look up, go to the docs, the PHP docs, and say, okay, string repeat, oh, this is what that's doing? Oh, okay. Then in my other language, it's equivalent to this other thing in the standard library. Whereas, basically I have to figure out, map the two standard libraries across one another. Whereas by having something a little bit more concrete, right, in the case of a for loop, I can basically look at it and go, okay, well, in JavaScript, I'm basically going to do that, right? I'm basically going to say, instead of dot equals, I'm going to say plus equals, and we're done. I've figured it out for JavaScript as well, right? And I didn't have to look at the standard library of PHP. I didn't have to look at the standard library of JavaScript. It's just that's the way it is. And so the choice becomes yours. And there are perfectly valid arguments as well, right? So string repeat, given that it's a little bit more closer to the metal, it might have some optimizations that the for loop doesn't, right? So basically the for loop because the for loop is basically not going to be able to take advantage of concurrency, right? It's a serial process, and so if I have 100 characters that I'm repeating every time, or I'm doing it 100 times, I've got to, it's going to be a serial operation. Now, string repeat, on the other hand, under the hood, might have the ability to say, you know what, we're going to queue these up into 100 different processes, and we're going to return them, and we're going to make sure that they all come back together in the same order, and then return it, right? So it might have some performance benefits, and I would suggest maybe taking a look at those and seeing what they are, and making sure that you understand the trade-off, because the trade-off is basically the difference between writing something, because we write code to be interpreted by a computer, yes, or executed by a computer, but we write code to be read by a human. And so by creating this for loop and things like that, it's like writing for the layman, right? But if you write a bunch of things that go with stuff from the standard library, it becomes more and more specialized language for somebody who knows the standard library of that language, right? And it's kind of like reading a neuroscience paper when you know nothing of neuroscience, right? They're going to be using terminology and all sorts of convoluted vernacular that you don't care about. But you read Wikipedia or some kind of other encyclopedia, and it's written more for the layman. So anyway, with that said, I probably am going to go ahead and do this refactoring and just delete that for loop, just because it seems like an okay trade-off in this particular case. So, and sorry, I didn't realize that was going to be as much of a rant as it was, or as much of a discussion as it was. Now, the other interesting one is the split, right? Because if you look at most of our functions, we can get away with, just one string, going straight to the library, the standard library, or two strings, or five, or two lines. And again, I'm not much of a line counter, but I am curious if there's something that we can do to make this a little bit shorter. And so, we may not actually have time. So when you look up, or when you do research and ask the question of like, hey, how do I split a string into an array? The thing that you typically will find is preg split, an empty, because so the first argument of preg split is a regular expression, and basically you do an empty regular expression with the Unicode check, so just the letter U. You pass in the string itself, and it does exactly what we're trying to do. You basically, you can pass null or zero, right, as the third argument, and that's how many results do you actually want. And then you can give it flags, and one of the flags is preg split no empty, all right? And so basically, if I say, instead of zero, if I say max splits, in theory, I'm just going to return this for now. So if I just return the result of preg split, our test should pass, or some of them should pass. Hello world, how are you? What do we get up here? Yeah, and these test names for this one aren't that great. So this is returning an array, so all of this should be in here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do hyphen hyphen, so PHP unit, vendor ben PHP unit, filter equals test can split on character. That's the first array one that we have. The fact that there are 3 failures. Oh, because it doesn't do. I wonder if I put it in quotes. Because the filter in PHP unit only checks for a prefix, right? So I'm going to rename this test. Test can split world by comma. So let's, because I only want to have one failing test. All right, so, and I'm going to move all the tests down here. Actually, let's just close these. All right, so now we're cleaned up a bit. And so split comma. Now what it's doing here is that it's splitting on everything, right? Like we're not paying attention to the separator. So for the regular expression, we should be putting in an array, and I'm going to put the regular expression into double quotes. So basically it's / open square bracket and close square bracket plus / u, and I don't do regular expressions, so if I'm messing up, like, sorry. So then with PHP you have template strings, right? So the double quotes converts it to kind of being a template string where you can kind of put in a variable. And that one passed. All right. So, good times. And then test can split character 2. That's not a good name. So this time what we're trying to do is the opposite. So test can split world by comma. This should be test can split comma by world. All right. And so I'm going to run that. That works. And so here we're wanting to do the split. So it's going to be test can split. Oops. Test can split comma by world, preserve empty. And we do have a failure. Failed asserting that 2 arrays are equal. One, two, three, four, 5 commas, 1, 2, 3, 4 commas, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Where is it finding? Where is it creating the 5th comma? One, two. And it should, the first string should be, right, like that first one should be empty, but it's not. I'm thinking this can't do. I mean, the other ones said that they're good, but I'm starting to doubt. Okay, so let's try this again. All right. Right, so I'm going to go ahead and do a vardump of result. And I've never understood why we keep joking about like having to do vardump as a bad thing. 1, 2, 3, 4. It's not. Oh, it's not preserving this. So let's do this. Return if we need to omit empty. Right. So if omit empty is true, we're going to do that. And I know people who go a little nuts with ternary operators, like they love them. I reserve them for very special cases. Like I saw one ternary operator, like, or stretch of ternary operators. It was like 6 or 7 deep, right? So it's basically, here's the condition, question mark, do something, and we're done, colon, condition, question mark, do something, right? Like, and it was nuts, and it was all on one line, and it was just, yeah. So this to me makes a lot of sense because it's basically saying, listen, I can tell what's different just by looking at it. I don't have to go, too crazy deep into it. But having said that, that now works. So let me go ahead and return these to being equals. Preserve empty. All right. And let's see. What's the next one? Test. So this, what we're testing the number of returns, right? So test split returns one of 3 of 2 possibles. All right, so filter equals, so 1 failure. So this didn't actually return, right? And so max splits is 1. Now the way that PHP actually looks at it is that I'm not going to try to explain it. I'm just going to say we have to basically, I'm going to do another ternary operator. Basically, max splits equals if max splits is greater than 0. Do I? No. Do I want to do a ternary operator here? If max splits equals 0, we can keep it at 0. Otherwise, what we need to do is max splits plus 1. Because part of our API is we want to basically say how many full chunks do you want? And we want to answer the question. We want the developer to answer the question, how many chunks do you, full chunks do you want of your filter? The way PHP reads it is how many chunks do you want, period. All right, so if we want one full chunk, what PHP needs is to know that you actually want 2 items in the returned array. All right, so go ahead and change that and hope that passes. It does. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to check. So this is test. Test split returns 2 of 2, returns 1 of 2. So now, right? All right, so now we've basically refactored this split method. And the thing about it is that what we can do, right? So in theory, well, not in theory, in reality, is we can sort of comment out all that code, and that's weird. But there is a test, and we are going to run it just as the last test. So, or no, I can't even run it as the last test. So there's a problem, but I'm not going to try to solve it right now. And basically, again, we do run into the problem of, somebody now, yeah, this function is shorter, but somebody has to inflate that preg split, right? Because that's what shortening and condensing things does a lot, is you have to be able to then inflate them and inflate them properly, right? Like your mind has to understand what preg split is, and in the same way that mine does, so that when we're talking preg split, we're not talking apples and oranges, right? Versus talking about an if statement and whether a conditional is logically true. So anyway, there is a problem, or can be a problem, and it has to do with certain types of multi-byte characters, and Sublime Text can't understand them. So you see it a lot with the skin tone ones, especially with Apple. And so let's go to, I'm going to say thumbs, right? So where is it? Where are you? Yeah. Come on. Do I have to hold it down? Yep. So with certain emoji, there's basically the primary skin tone or flesh tone or whatever. And then, Apple and other companies have added in other skin tones, which is awesome. It's all well and good. But it makes processing strings difficult, okay? And basically, because given the way that we are separating this, the way that this gets exploded out, it will actually explode the two separate characters, right? So preg split. And I feel like I'm not explaining this well. So let's go to REPL. I'm going to start a PHP. Really? Can I not alphabet? Is that the problem? All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a string inside this REPL because it can understand the skin tones. So I'm going to say hello, and I'm going to choose this female face, but I'm going to choose a darker skin tone than the default yellow. And if we come in here and we say preg split, just the thing that makes us get an array based off of these characters. And then I'm going to do print r array, right, and go ahead and run that. Right. So wrong string. There we go. So you notice what happens is it's like, okay, HELLO, comma, space. Everything's cool up until this point. But then we get to the actual emoji, right? Sally. We'll call her Sally. So we get to the emoji that represents Sally. And basically what we end up with is actually 4 indices inside of our array when it gets separated. And that's because the Apple emoji, at least this style of emoji, is actually made up of multiple Unicode characters or UTF characters. So you have the yellow-faced Sally, a color chip that is overlaid to say, no, this is the tint of skin I want Sally to have, an empty byte, which I don't know what it is, and then like part of somebody's forehead, right? And that's what ends up as part of our array. So depending on who puts in what characters to our string class, like that array may not work out so well using the preg split. And so the question we have to ask ourselves as the creators of this is, how important is that, right? Is that something we just say we don't support, right? Like we don't support compound Unicode characters? Or is that something we got to figure out how to support? I'm kind of okay with it right now, mainly because if you see, like inside of Sublime Text itself, I can put the yellow thumbs up, right, the yellow skin tone thumbs up, but I cannot insert the brown or a darker skin tone or a different skin tone, like from the lightest to the darkest, doesn't matter. I can't just insert that into Sublime Text. So we actually have no way to really test it that I'm aware of. And maybe I'll try a different IDE later, but like that's kind of where we're at. So that's a pretty nice refactoring, and hopefully we covered sort of the pros and cons of using the standard library versus not. And yeah, so as always, thank you for making the time. I really do appreciate it, and I'll see you next time.